and we can talk about our first topic, which is education. The conversation we had a few weeks ago. Um, we're just going to talk. Maybe we're probably going to go over 15 minutes, but just about 15 minutes in picking a topic and discussing it based purely on the data and analysis we have of that data, and then just extrapolating from there. So the conversation we had a few weeks ago was the proposal Bernie had on separating property taxes as the main source of funding from public schools, primary and secondary schools in the United States, and how I believe it's about 50% of all public education funding comes from local property taxes, which means the local wealth of a district will determine the quality of education that children receive there, which is something that would be seen as abhorrent and unacceptable in other countries, like in Western Europe. So Q has some great data for us, and we can start from there.
Okay, guys, I've got what we have in dark green. We have the amount of money spent per pupil, per state, and it's all in alphabetical order right now. And then the light green bars are the real estate, the real estate taxes per state. So just comparing everything from 2008, 2009, 2010, and 2011, just in terms of what everything looks like, there are some states that have started spending less on students, and there's some states that have started spending more on students. But just from a quick look, you can tell, obviously, which states spend more per student. The two biggest ones are like New York, New Mexico. We've also got Vermont, District of Columbia, and Connecticut. So generally, the amount spent per student doesn't change too much, but it does, there's a percent difference from 2008 to 2011. Like Georgia has decreased the amount of spending per student the most, I think by about 14%, taking into consideration of inflation. I believe Illinois, but between like 2010 and 2011, it's like Illinois, between 2008 and 2011 with Illinois, they spent like 8% more, but between 2010 and 2011, they started spending a little bit less. But they've increased.
Most likely Chicago. That's most likely due to
Probably.
Chicago.
Yeah, probably. And they've also increased the real estate tax, though. So it doesn't seem like the real estate tax really affects anything in terms of how much is spent per student, in my opinion. I've also got, let me change the window real fast. Performance rates, education performance rates per state. Let me find the window. Here it is. So per state, so let's go to Georgia. So here in Georgia, you can tell that them spending less per student has really affected things. Obviously, the yellow is their, I believe, performing average compared to national, and the red means they're performing below average. And this is grade 4, and that's grade 8, and this is the year 2015. And things seem to be not so great. Their reading has actually, looks like it started to improve this past year, but their mathematics is down, and so is their science. Jumping over to Illinois, over here, their reading also seems to have improved, but their mathematics seems to have decreased a little bit too, and they're faring fairly poorly. They're pretty even in terms of science. But if we come up here to like, let's go to Vermont because it's got great numbers. Go to Vermont, obviously. They tend to be above average in a lot of things. They don't have any data on science. But just looking at these sort of things on student performance compared to what's spent per pupil, per state, it seems very important. And increasing real estate tax, as seen with Illinois, doesn't seem to help. If we also, let me go down and see Georgia. They also increased it, but they started spending less per student as well. That went from $10,000 per student to about $9,600 per student, but they increased. There was a little bit of an increase. It kind of stayed the same, $795 to $800. So it doesn't really seem to be kind of doing anything, in my opinion. I'm not sure why they do real estate tax. So that's just kind of two different states. Are there any other states y'all want me to compare, or are you guys going to take it off from here?
I'd say one thing is, and my question is, maybe Anoa could answer this, is what the difference would be if the tax rate, and thus the funding would be different from one part of the state to the others. For example, I live in Maryland, and Maryland, like Martin O'Malley raved about when he was a candidate, has one of the most highly rated education systems in the country, and a lot of that is due to Montgomery County. Montgomery County in Maryland is a very wealthy county. It has a very large tax base, and it has a very, very good public education system. And that may have caused a bump compared to, let's say, Baltimore County and Baltimore City, which does not have a very good inner city public school system. And it's made some improvements recently, but it's still below average. And so I was wondering if you could answer if that could be a factor, maybe not statewide, but intrastate from one area of a state, like the whiter suburbs or the poorer inner cities.
Well, I know when I was looking it up earlier that when it comes to education, I forgot what the term for it was, but real estate taxes and just the government spending on education, when real estate tax comes in, they sometimes, I think Vermont, like they get more than they need, so they're able to send it. They get more, so they're able to send it to other places, or they're able to send it out of state. So definitely, if they get revenue from it, they may be able to disperse it throughout the state, or maybe even send it out of state. From my investigations, from what it seemed like, what were the two counties you mentioned? Because I can look up their property tax data if you want me to. Or were you just more thinking about education funding?
We can, yeah. Like I said, Montgomery County in Maryland compared to like Baltimore County, and see if there's just
So,
a significant difference there, if there is one.
okay. So the 2010 and 2009 year data for Maryland looks like let me get it in this window so everyone else can see too. Oh, it's there. Is it there? Yeah. Okay. So it looks to be like 1% for Montgomery County, and then what was the other county?
Baltimore County.
Baltimore County. And there's about the same in terms of U.S. taxes as a percent of home value. But I mean, let me see. Okay, so it looks like Montgomery County actually gets like $1,000 more, though, and I guess that just might be the different houses or distribution or something or other. So, you know, definitely if they make more money in one area than they might need, then it can go to other parts of the state if necessary. They may not, you know, obviously it depends on the government and what they want to do with the money, whether or not they want to spend it. But that definitely could play a factor into things.
Gotcha. Because that's probably the starkest example I can think of in my state. Montgomery County has a very stellar education system, and it also has some of the highest housing prices in America. And Baltimore County and Baltimore City it's pretty much the opposite.
Yeah, so, yeah, and Vermont is the same way. They have like, I forget what the percentage is, but it's just ridiculous housing prices when it comes to, I think, businesses and residential. I'm not sure, but some area of their housing is just really expensive, so they're able to make a ton of revenue and send it out of state rather than even need to spend it on their own stuff.
So no, what do you think about the differences regarding property taxes and school funding?
Um, I think part of the issue is that when you look at certain communities, and I don't really know much about Maryland, so I can't speak specifically about the difference between Montgomery County and PG County. Also have large black populations as well. So what the comment I
Yeah.
was going to make, you know, would not apply necessarily to that area. The difference between a Montgomery County and a Baltimore County. However, there has definitely been um, issues in terms of systematic, disinvestment in communities, but as well as when we're talking about funding based on property values. I was just having this conversation with my aunt from New York earlier. Um, you know, that like when you have a history of devaluing property, because people of a certain race or group live in a certain area, or we talk about redlining. I mean, there's so many different issues. And actually, I guess I can talk about Baltimore because there was a recent report just released about how redlining and other things like kept costs down, well, housing values and stuff down, like in Baltimore area. So there are policies and practices that have been done that like depress housing values in certain communities over the last several decades or whatever, right? So now we have a system where those things, now even though we supposedly don't do those things anymore, redlining supposedly is illegal. But now we have a system evaluation in place, whether we no longer do the things that led to that system. We have the system that we have, and then we use that system to fund, education. And so I'm thinking like when we're thinking about, some of the stuff that we were talking about in terms of, some of the lesser known comments and plans of Bernie's directly involved in public education, addressing the way funding comes from at the state and local level, because there's different pots of money involved. Being based on property values. I mean, yeah, if you live in a great neighborhood, if you're like in Aspen, Colorado, if you're in a Montgomery County, if you're in certain communities, yes, having property taxes go towards education, that's great. It works for you, no big. But when you don't necessarily get as much from that equation, it does lead. That's one aspect that can lead to different disparities, and other issues and stuff in terms of education. And I know that like we had there's several different teachers groups for Bernie out there. There's like public teachers for Bernie. There's an Illinois Teachers for Bernie group. And I remember the article that you shared with Ben and I before from Huffington Post from like January sometime about Bernie Sanders wanting to do away with, reliance on that system of funding via property taxes. I got these enthusiastic, when I posted, I got these enthusiastic comments from some teachers who were saying that people don't realize how big of an issue that is in terms of access and resources for their schools and stuff. I mean, I don't really think, when we're talking about the issues with unfair and equitable funding, I mean, that is a good place to start. There are some other issues in terms of, when you look at the different requirements and whether people are losing money based on test scores and other things like that. But I think that is, look at the property tax angle, that is a good place to start, and it will have a meaningful impact, right? If we can have a better way of addressing that.
Yeah, I think the question would be what the solution would be is one, what tax you would use to replace it. I think I saw in a lot the sales tax, which people have their own debate on whether the property tax should be replaced with a sales tax as the main source of funding. But then how you implement it and mandate it for states to change it, because it's a state and local issue. So how does the federal government press that? I think is the question in Bernie's plan. And I'm not sure. It's a good question. I've thought of a few. Do you know? Do you have any ideas on how you would implement something like that?
I will have to say that no, I'm not that familiar. But what I would like to see is further development of this discussion, because these are the types of conversations we need to be having. Whether we have a Bernie Sanders presidency or we're talking at like our local levels. I mean, because statewide, we're having issues in terms of you have states that have what they call like regressive school funding, and like you provide less money to schools with higher concentrations of students from low-income families. So you have these other things layered on top of that. So I think that whatever would replace, like you're saying, like whatever tax we would use to replace, use reliance on property taxes. I mean, there's probably some examples where property taxes alone, like the spending per pupil itself, isn't the actual issue. There are other issues involved, right? So for a lot of schools, that could be a huge boost in terms of resources. Ooh, excuse me. And providing, for different resources and benefits, the basics. Like some places, having a physical textbook, excuse me, is a big deal. But then you have there are some schools where, like, if you don't meet a certain level of rating and stuff, you get certain funding cut or whatever, right? So there are all these different mechanisms that disproportionately impact schools with higher concentrations of low income students, and like even that definition, like low income, when they're using that, like when they use that as a standard of evaluating students, like we like, oh, this school has like 60% low income, oh, it's so poor. Like low income, the definition of low income, because they use the definition basically what's used for like when you're trying to qualify for free or reduced lunch. So those are families in a lot of cases, especially if you're talking about kids with reduced lunch, who maybe have like 3-4 kids and are making like $40,000 a year.
Yeah.
So like we're not just talking about. I mean, it's definitely a problem. We're talking about like the poor, heavy concentrations of the poorest of the poor, but this is really like we're talking. This is a very broad issue.
Yeah, the
And
median income is like what,
right,
50,000? So that's not all.
right. So it's not like this is just some, because this goes back into the whole like not everybody's poor conversation too, right? Like we have to be careful because a lot of these phrases are used interchangeably. Poor, poverty, low income, they don't all mean the same thing, and it also depends upon what government program you're talking about, how it's measured, and what you're trying to achieve. Because even if it's the same program, but it has different outcomes, the different measurements might be different that are used. So I do think that it's definitely something to become, have some more ideas. And then I don't know, like out there in the chat room, I know there's been there's chats going on, but like, what do you guys think about this conversation about property funding? I know if we legalize weed, Colorado seems to have a big influx of
Yeah,
money for
yeah,
sale,
there's a
right?
big one. Like if we could get Bernie to do it for that reason, that would be great. Like, hey Bernie, if you legalize weed, there's the funding for public schools right there. That could fund it alone, most likely. That would be huge.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, go ahead, Q.
yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And if this wasn't, and if we focused on like just a single state like Illinois and just looked at it county by county, I think this kind of stuff would be much more apparent because, yeah, property taxes, vary county by county, and they're totally different in some areas, more so than others. And obviously, education needs are different in different parts of the state. Um, just probably in Texas, there's a difference obviously between South Texas and undocumented immigrants coming in and their education needs versus in North Texas, where there's just a ton of like the DFW Metroplex area, and there's just a ton of things in there going on. There's just different things going on. And another thing I would have loved to look at obviously is how childcare, obviously investing in childcare, and just all the different stuff involved with how education affects kids, how education affects everyone else, because it's a pursuit of knowledge thing, and it's not just, it's not a very, it's like you guys said, it's very broad, and you can't focus on one specific thing and hope it works.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because when I think about like talking about Illinois, right? Like you may have like if you have the data, I don't know if you can like Cook County, for example, right? That's where Chicago is. You may have actually, when you look at like the cost per pupil, um, it can be high in some places, but that doesn't necessarily translate, or the property tax can be high in certain places, but that doesn't necessarily translate into actual, good education, right? So it's only one aspect of the conversation. I just got a text message from one of my friends who's watching, and she's in Maryland, lives in Montgomery County. She was just saying PG County actually has higher tax rate than their property taxes are higher, but their school system is not nearly as well. And I mean, that's another aspect in terms of, you know, management and other issues too that all go into it. But I do think that like kind of going along with that, you know, we need to like, we have a question from the chat room, like how do we transform this data, like how do we transform this understanding and knowledge of like property taxes and differentiation into actual you know, action? How do we make this actionable? How do we use this information as we're going forward?